Welcome back. Today is your first set of notes on Unit 3. Unit 3 is broken down into two sections, development and industry. These notes are on development. Our two essential questions are, why does development vary among countries, and where are more developed countries and less developed countries distributed? Before we begin, we need to define development. Development is the quality of life based on access to wealth, education, health, and technology resources. Development is often thought of as a spectrum, meaning countries can move up and down this spectrum over time and depending on situations. Just because a country moves up a level doesn't mean that they can't move back down a level if something were to happen. The three categories are MDC, or more developed country. These are often your Western countries. The middle country is your NIC, or your newly industrializing country. And then the last one is LDC, or your less developed countries. Right? When we think about MDC versus LDC, it's often a first world versus a third world mentality. MDCs would be considered first world countries, whereas LDCs would be considered third world countries. Within each of these countries, there are different economic systems. An economic system is the structure in which resources are distributed. So, how the government and the economy works together. There are three main types of economic systems: capitalism, communism, and socialism. Capitalism is a market economy in which the prices of goods and services are determined by supply and demand. We have a capitalist economy system today in the United States. Communism is a planned economy in which the central government determines the price of goods and services and controls the factors of production. North Korea is an example of a communist country. Socialism is a mixed economy that incorporates some private and some government ownership of resources. China would be an example of a socialist country today. Okay. There are easier ways to simplify socialism, capitalism, and communism. So this is the cow analogy. So imagine that you have two cows. If you lived in a socialist country like China, you would give one of your cows to your neighbor. Each of you would then have a cow. Do whatever you want with it. Okay? If you lived in a capitalist country like the United States and you have two cows, you can do whatever you want with your cows. You'll probably sell one of your cows and buy a bull. Therefore, you can mate your cow and your bull together, and your herd can multiply and you can make more money. If you live in a communist country like North Korea, you would have two cows. The state would take all of the milk, or the state would take both of the cows and give you some of the milk in return, meaning you don't actually own the cows and you don't have two cows anymore. The Cold War was the real turning point in the world's history in which you have the emergence of first world versus third world countries. Okay? The first world countries are all the countries that are in green. Second world countries were mainly Eastern Europe. And the third world countries were everybody else. Okay? Since the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, a lot of these classifications have remained the same, where second and third world countries are working on becoming second and first world countries. Okay, so how do we measure development? How do we measure the things that determine if a country is a first world or a second world, if it's more developed, less developed, or newly industrializing? Well, we look at social, economic, and demographic factors when we measure development. Okay? And an index that we use is something that's called the Human Development Index, or the HDI. The Human Development Index is created by the UN, or the United Nations, and it's comprised of lots of different statistics in which a country is graded. Okay, so it talks about their gross domestic product, what their literacy rate is, their education rate, and life expectancy. Depending on the rates of each of these things, countries are scored on a scale of 0 to 1. Currently, the highest scoring country, or the most developed country, is Norway with a score of 0.97, and the lowest developed country is Niger with a score of 0.34. This map shows the Human Development Index throughout the world. You will see that the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, and Japan and South Korea all have a very high Human Development Index. Okay? They have a score of over a 0.9 or above. These are going to be your countries that are considered your more developed countries. Then, if you look at the orangey countries, so Latin America, a large percentage of Eastern Europe and Asia as a whole, those are all countries that have a medium Human Development Index. These are going to be your newly industrializing countries. And then at the bottom, a large part of Africa, these are countries that have a Human Development Score of below 0.5. These are going to be your less developed countries. Currently, the United States is ranked 13th on the Human Development Index, and this is largely due to our life expectancy, our GDP, and our literacy and education rates. Okay? We do not have universal health care, therefore we have a lower life expectancy than a lot of European countries. We also have a large wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots. All of these things play into a country's classification on the Human Development Index. And these numbers are updated each year by the UN. Question number 1. Which of the following choices are factors for measuring development? Economic, cultural, historical, or all of the above? The answer is all of the above. This is kind of a trick question. The cultural factors are also known as the social factors. Okay? And then your historical factors are also your demographic factors or your hardcore data factors. So all three of these things factor into measuring development. So what are some economic factors? The first major economic factor that geographers look at when measuring development is the gross domestic product, or the GDP. The gross domestic product is the value of all goods and services produced within a country in 1 year. And GDP is often divided by the population, and we call that a GDP per capita. So that's like on average, how much money per person are we making in goods and services? Like what's our value? And the GDP per capita measures the average wealth. Okay? So like if you were to add up everybody's money and then divide it by how many people there are, you're going to get your GDP per capita. Categories of jobs also vary by development. So when we look at jobs, we classify jobs into 3 main sectors: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary sector jobs are jobs that involve obtaining some sort of resource from the earth. So farming, fishing, or mining are all examples. When I think of primary sector jobs, I think of things that you physically do with your hands in which you gain things from the earth's surface. The next level of jobs is secondary sector. Secondary sector jobs are the manufacturing or the processing. That's using those things produced in the primary sector to build something or to create something. And then the third sector of job is the tertiary sector. The tertiary sector is the service industry. These are jobs in which face-to-face interactions are happening, such as retail, banking, and healthcare. Okay. A final level of economic indicators for development is your access to consumer goods. How many citizens have cell phones, cars, TVs, things like that. The higher your access, the higher your level of development. And this map shows total GDP. Again, gross domestic product, the value of all goods or services, the average wealth. So this is total GDP, so this is not per person, right, but total GDP. You'll notice that the United States, a couple countries in Europe, Russia, China, India, Japan, all have really high GDPs. And this is where a lot of our manufacturing and commercial business takes place. Whereas the large majority of Africa has a small GDP. Okay? You have not a ton of major economic activity happening. This map shows GDP per capita. Remember, GDP per capita is the average wealth. So it's saying like the average person would make this much money. So in the United States, Canada, parts of Europe, Japan, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, you have your GDP of 30,000 or above, which means on average, each person makes $30,000 a year or higher. Okay, these are going to be your more developed countries. Your less developed countries are the countries in the pale yellow. They're the ones that are making $3,000 per year or less per person on average. Okay, so to put that into perspective, countries that are in the pale yellow color that have low GDPs in an entire year, they are making less than I make in 1 month. Okay, so this map right here, or this graphic, shows us the job sector breakdown depending on development. So on the left, we see the United States, where the majority of our jobs are going to be tertiary sector jobs. These are service industry jobs. Okay, teaching is a service industry job. Then 23% is manufacturing or processing, that's building things. And a very small percentage, roughly 2%, are our primary sector jobs. Okay, that's obtaining resources from the earth. So the United States is a more developed country. Brazil is in the middle. Brazil is considered a newly industrializing country. Roughly half of the jobs in Brazil are under the tertiary sector, okay, meaning service industry jobs. And then the other half is split between primary sector and secondary sector. So process and manufacturing, and then like farming and mining. Okay. Nepal is a third world country. And in third world countries, the majority of people are all primary sector employees, meaning that they are working to obtain something from the earth's surface. The majority of them are going to be farmers. You have a very small percentage of people that work in the secondary sector. That's your processing and manufacturing. And then you have a roughly 20% of people that work in your tertiary sector or your service industry jobs, your face-to-face stuff. Okay. So again, you can see the breakdown. The higher the level of tertiary sector activities, the higher the level of development. The higher the level of primary sector activities, the lower the level of development. Again, this is another map that shows the different types of jobs based on development over the years. So you can see that as the years have gone on, tertiary sector jobs have increased in more developed and less developed countries, and your secondary sector jobs in your more developed countries have decreased, while they have increased in your less developed countries. This is called outsourcing. It's where your more developed countries are outsourcing their processing and their manufacturing to newly industrializing or less developed countries. That's why a lot of our goods that we buy off of Amazon come from countries other than the United States. So how can this relate to the demographic transition model? Well, we know that 0 countries are in stage 1. Okay, stage 2 are usually our less developed countries. Stage 3 is going to be our newly industrializing countries. And then stage 4 and potentially stage 5 are our more developed countries. Question number 2. The value of all goods and services produced within or by a country in a year is known as what? This is our GDP, or our gross domestic product. Remember, when they are looking at GDP per capita, they are looking at the value or the average value of goods or services per person. So the amount of wealth. An example of a primary sector activity is what? That would be mining. Primary sector activities are obtaining some sort of resource from the earth. Okay, this map shows access to technology. The higher somebody's access, typically the higher the level of development. So you can see your more developed countries are these 2 darker red colors, whereas your newly industrializing is the light tan, and then your less developed is the yellow. Okay, so what are social indicators of development? Social indicators of development are factors that are related to education, health, and safety. Okay, so your education rates and your literacy rates are both social indicators. So, how many people in your country can read, and then also what your student to teacher ratio is going to be. And then healthcare and welfare are also social indicators. So, calorie consumption, the number of hospitals and doctors and nurses per capita, and then your healthcare expenditures are also worked into this. Anytime you see the word per capita, that just means per person. So this map shows your student to teacher ratio. Okay, your top two categories here below 15 and then 15 to 19 are going to be your more developed countries, meaning you have roughly 15 to 19 kids per teacher at the primary level or the elementary level. Whereas then the tannish color or the light yellow color represents your less developed countries, where you have 30 or more students for one teacher. This is caloric intake, so how many calories somebody is getting as a percent of their requirements. So if they are one of the two darker green countries or colors, it means that they are getting enough nutrients. They're getting higher than their required caloric intake. They're getting higher than their requirements. They have an abundance of food. They have excess food. Whereas the pale yellow color means that they do not have enough food, and hunger and starvation and malnutrition are an issue in those countries. Okay, again, this map shows doctors and doctors per 1,000 people. So you will notice that the United States is not in the highest category for physicians per 1,000 people, versus instead the majority of Europe all have a lot of doctors. This has to go with the idea of universal health care is more widely accepted in Europe. It's also easier to go to school to become a doctor in Europe because of various education tracks. So you're tested and then you're placed into an education tract. Whereas in the United States, anybody can become a doctor if they want to, but they just have to complete the schooling, which is very rigorous. How is gender equality measured? Gender equality is also an indicator of development. Currently, the United Nations say that no country has perfect gender equality. There's always some sort of disproportion between male and female. More developed countries, however, oftentimes have higher equality than less developed countries. The UN also created the Gender Development Index, or the GDI. It's very similar to the Human Development Index, but it uses statistics that reflect gender differences. So it compares income, education, and life expectancy between men and women and then grades countries. And then the Gender Empowerment Measure measures the ability of women to participate in economics and politics and compares labor and income statistics with political involvement. So this map shows the Gender Development Index. So the dark purple countries have a score of 0.9 or higher, meaning they have more gender equality than the pale yellow countries that have a Gender Development Index of a below 0.5. Okay, this map shows female income as a percent of male income. So the dark brown countries are where females make roughly 70 to 84% of what a man makes. So if a man made $1 an hour, women would make 70 to 84 cents per hour. The pale yellow countries are below 40% of what a man makes. So we know that there is no exact gender equality in pay and income. And then you see this spread throughout the world as well. Okay, this map shows life expectancy. So the number of years that females are expected to live longer than males. You will notice in Eastern Europe, women are expected to live 10 or more years longer than their male counterparts. And then in the United States, it's 5 to 9 more years, and then it decreases from there. Okay, politics, so the percent of seats in parliament held by women. So the dark brown countries have 30 or above, so 30% or higher of the government positions are held by women. Australia and New Zealand both have very high women percentages. They're both run by females, like the majority of their government is female operated, whereas the United States is coming in at 19 to 10%. This number has since increased in our last election 2 years ago, and I'll be really curious to see the results of this current election to see how the gender balance in politics in the United States is determined. Okay, so lastly, what are demographic indicators of development? This is like historical levels. So we're talking life expectancy, infant mortality rate, natural increase rate, birth rate, dependency ratio, gender balance, all things that we looked at in Unit 2. Okay, so the higher your life expectancy, typically the higher your level of development. This should be a review from Unit 2. The global gender gap, so equality between men and women. The larger the gap, typically, the lower the level of development. Question number 4. Which of the following is an indicator of a country's level of development? Access to phones, literacy rate, caloric intake, infant mortality rate, both B and D, or all of the above? Your answer is going to be all of the above. Okay, so where are the world's more developed countries? Okay, now that we know what a more developed country is, more developed countries are North America, so the United States and Canada. They make up the largest consumer market and food exporter. Europe contains nations with the highest human development index levels. Russia has recently transitioned from communism to a market economy. This transition has been troublesome in the past, but Russia is continuing to improve and work their way up their development levels. Japan has invested heavily in education and training and developed a reputation for quality tech products. And then Oceania, so Australia and New Zealand, are closely connected with the UK. Our world's newly industrializing countries, or developing countries, are areas in Latin America, countries in which the most urbanized areas of your less developed regions. You have large income gaps in parts of Latin America where you have really, really, really wealthy people and then people who are still living in a shack. East Asia, we're talking about China. You have free market reforms that are leading to growth in labor, a large supply of labor and resources. And then Southwest Asia, this is like Middle East area, where you have a reliant on imports, but they're making a ton of money on oil to fund development. Okay, this picture represents Latin America's giant income gap. So on one side of the fence, you have a wealthy neighborhood in which people have like hot tubs or pools on every level of their balcony. And then on the other side, you have people that are living in like lean-to shacks, basically. They probably don't have running water, and they might not even have electricity. China's economy is expanding rapidly thanks to outsourcing. So a lot of American companies have moved their product development to China or their resources to China. So their products are built there and then shipped to the United States to be sold. And then the United Arab Emirates is spending a lot of their oil money on development. So on the left, you have a man-made island. And then on the right, you have an indoor ski park in the middle of the desert. Okay, our world's less developed countries are found in Southeast Asia, where you have cheap labor that has stimulated manufacturing. Again, it's outsourcing. This is where people are paid pennies on the dollar to build products. Central Asia has new discoveries of oil that's starting to bring in economy and jobs. South Asia, India has the world's second fastest growing economy with the labor industry. And then Sub-Saharan Africa has large amounts of valuable minerals, but their development has been slowed by colonialism and political instability. Okay, so for example, mining in Zambia, these workers are doing everything by hand, so it's very labor intensive. They don't make a lot of money for what they're doing. And then Western companies often own these mines and then sell the gems in Western economies. But they bring in jobs to the area. Pretty much if you draw a line across the equator, across the world, countries to the north, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, would be considered your more developed countries, and then countries to the south would be considered your less developed countries. Okay, so North America, Europe, Russia, Oceania, Japan are all of your more developed, versus Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southwest Asia, North Africa, Central, East, South, and Southeast Asia would all be less developed or newly industrializing. Okay, question number 5. All of the following are considered to be more developed regions except what? Your answer is going to be Southwest Asia, North Africa. Okay, these are areas that are becoming newly industrializing. Okay, so last couple things. How do countries improve their development? We have a couple models that geographers came up with to describe this transition from one stage to the next. Countries can focus on specific resources or comparative advantages to promote growth. This is Rostow's model, which countries have 5 stages. Traditional society, these are going to be your less developed countries. The majority of people work in the primary sector, low income. Then the next stage is preconditions for takeoff. So this is when those countries have made investments in technology and infrastructure. There starts to become jobs available. Then the next stage is takeoff, where you have rapid growth in niche industries. So you have very specialized job markets that are emerging. Maybe this country becomes really good at building cars. Okay. Then the next stage is your drive to maturity. So increased income in that country promotes growth in other sectors. People are now making money. They're in turn spending money elsewhere. So you have other sectors that are starting to grow. Workers are becoming more skilled. And then the last stage is the age of mass consumption, where you have a shift towards manufacturing and consumer goods and high-tech products. Okay. Rostow's model is known as the modernization model, or the ladder of development. So countries have to go through these 5 stages when moving from a less developed country to a more developed country. They can't just jump from a traditional society to an age of mass consumption. They have to go through the steps. Another model to discuss improving development is the core periphery model. This is by a guy by the name of Wallerstein. It's called Wallerstein's world system theory model. And it shows the relationship between core, periphery, and semi-periphery countries. So core countries are your more developed countries. These are countries that require your education, your technology, your infrastructure, things like that. And periphery countries are going to be your less developed countries. And then semi-periphery countries are your newly industrializing countries. So it shows the relationship how core countries or more developed countries can use less developed or periphery countries for cheap labor and raw materials to produce the goods that are going to be sold to other core countries or semi-periphery countries and vice versa. Okay, these were long. So you have 2 questions that you need to answer. So number one is, why does development vary among countries? Okay, why do we have more developed countries, less developed countries, newly industrializing? How do we measure that? And then number two is, where are these countries distributed? Where are our world's more developed countries and less developed countries? When you are finished with your notes summary, please do not forget to submit.